Okay, welcome to social psychology. I'm going to walk through some slides here for chapter 1 with you. These videos are intended to point you in the right direction to preparing for the class to get a better sense of what you've been reading about in the book. Sometimes I will just direct your attention to concepts in the book or in the bigger set of notes that will be on Canvas. So this is a shortened version of the PowerPoint notes that you will find on Canvas for chapter 1, because I will not cover all this. If the video went too long, nobody would watch it. So I'm trying to use this video time to illustrate points that may be confusing or that I think just need a little elaboration. So to begin with, the question is, what is social psychology? This is the class we're taking now. And it is a combination of two things. It is sociology, psychology combined. So if you had a sociology class, you know sociology studies groups. If you've had me for intro psychology or had a psychology class in general, you know that psychology looks like the individual, like the nervous system, sensation and perception, development across a lifespan. That's one person. So social psychology is how the person affects a group and how a group affects the person. So it is that interaction. So it's really somewhere between sociology and psychology. That is social psychology. And it looks at affect, behavior, and cognitions. And I put up here how the real or imagined presence of others affects us. So a person doesn't even have to be in the room, but that person can affect our thoughts, that's the cognition, how we behave, and also our affect, that's our emotional state. So you could think about your best friend and like how would they act in this situation? Even though they're not present in the room with you, that could still affect how you behave. There are 4 core assumptions that I'd like to direct your attention to. I'll just mention briefly. One is that behavior is a result of interaction between the person and the situation. And the situational variables typically are underestimated by most people. I put this picture down here of, when you lose a game and afterwards you're supposed to go out and thank, high five the opposing team. The losing team probably doesn't feel like it, but the situation demands it. Good sportsmanship is like, basically you will go out there and be nice to the team that just beat you. So that's the demands of the situation. Left to their own devices, most people on the team probably would not be doing that. Another one is that our behavior depends on how we make sense of reality. So, and this is the core of therapy. I also work as a therapist in Columbia. I'm often just trying to get at how people explain the behaviors of others and explain the world to themselves. And if we can work with that and help shift that a little bit, oftentimes that helps make people more mentally healthy and typically happier. If a person is going around in the world just being very suspicious of everyone's motives, and that will make them more fearful and scared of interacting with others. So if we can get out, okay, where is that coming from? Well, how are you constructing that explanation of other people's behaviors? In therapy, we often go back to early learning experiences, which help form a template for how you expect others to treat you. Another core assumption is that behavior is strongly influenced by the social situation and our social cognition. So it's not just the situation, but it's like how we think about it. So if you were going to go meet a friend of a friend and you heard that this person had been talking smack about you, that's going to affect your expectations and you're probably going to treat them poorly. Now, you may have been told that, but that may have been a rumor that was a lie. But still, because you're thinking that is going to affect how you treat that person, how you behave. So again, it's the combination of these factors which is going to determine our behavior. And the last assumption in social psychology is that the only way to make sense or try to understand how people behave and to predict it is use the scientific method. And I will spend the last half of this video, talking about the scientific method in social psychology. I put this slide up here. Your book spends a fair amount of time talking about how the history of social psychology evolved. I want you to read that, pay attention to it, but I'm not going to talk about it here. Also, this first chapter tries to make a point of that human behavior has been influenced by nature, our genes, our DNA, our biology, and nurture, which is culture. Some of the biological factors which influence us is looking out for ourselves. Sometimes we're looking out for others. Actually, If you look out, self-concern is really about your own survival and survival of those closest to you. Actually, there's something called kin selection, which appears to be recognized as influenced by our biological, what we inherit, is that we are going to look out for those who are most genetically closely related to us. And that happens not only among humans, but that happens amongst a whole group of animals, including birds, squirrels, ants, bees. You can see all this. So two concerns which appear to kind of go back to our biology. We're concerned with our own survival and the survival of those close to us and others in general, because we as human beings are social animals. A lot of times our survival has been dependent upon being a part of a functioning group. Also, culture affects our behavior, so not just biological factors, but it's the social norms. And we don't even see our culture because it's like fish swimming in water. You just don't even pay attention to it. But culture includes the shared beliefs and attitudes, the expectations for behavior, morals, the social scripts you take as being a student, as being a parent, as being a child, being a boyfriend or girlfriend, the symbols we use and the rituals we have. All these things are aspects of culture that influence us, that is a big part of social psychology. There are cultural variations on all sorts of things. And I put it like sleep. In Japanese culture, kids often sleep with their parents until early adolescence. That's not often done in other cultures. How time is treated. Is it okay to be late for some things? In some cultures, yes. In some other cultures, less so. Let's see, how is interpersonal space affected? In some cultures, standing very close to one another when you're talking to them, that's okay. In American culture, that's typically less okay. So there are some things that influence our social behavior that are part of what we get from our cultural inheritance. One aspect of cultural inheritance that is not really recognized by your book as much as I wish it would be is that the findings we're going to talk about this semester in social psychology is that they come from studies that have been conducted in individualistic cultures that focus on the individual. So there are collectivist and individualistic cultures. Collectivism is this typically it's more commonly characterized in Eastern Asian cultures. It's a value of harmony, looking out for the other, of interdependence. Individualism is like, it's all about me and my rights. So 70% of the world typically lives in more collectivist societies. And if you look at it, actually, some people have argued that thinking about individualism versus collectivism is on one continuum, you're either one or the other. But I think a better way to consider it is that cultures can vary independently on how much they prioritize individualism and also how much they prioritize collectivism. So I think that actually would be safer to try to measure that way. Actually, and speaking of measuring it, measures like on a survey in terms of like people who endorse these items would be higher in individualism. I tend to do my own thing, and others in my family do the same. Let's see, I take great pride in accomplishing what no one else can do. I know my strengths and weaknesses. I like my privacy. I state my opinions. That's all true of people in individualistic cultures like the US and Western Europe. Collectivists typically, to me, pleasure spending time with others. Before I make a decision, I always consult with others. It is, and authority is totally respected. It is about interdependence and making sure group harmony is maintained. If you look at a map of the world, as you can see in red, you have the more individualistic cultures, those who value that more. And in orange and green, you typically see more collectivist cultures. So, I mean, you got China and like Western South America, like Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru. Those are typically, Colombia, more collectivist oriented. And Russia too, I mean, it's a little bit more collectivist than the US for sure. If you look within the US, the most collectivist states are in the South. And also Hawaii. Hawaii's influenced heavily by Eastern cultures like Polynesia and Asian cultures. So they tend to have more collectivist values. The least collectivist is the Northwest, as like white settlers moved across the continent. Those who wanted to be furthest away from everybody else and said, don't put your rules and laws on me, ended up in the total Northwest. That's where you see the most libertarians in the US now. That's a political philosophy. It's like, don't tread on me. Don't put your rules on me. Oregon and Montana is the reason, like Washington is one of the first states to legalize marijuana. And I was like, yeah, we're not going by the national laws. We're doing our own. Missouri ranks number 33 in collectivism, so we're not very high in it. But I'm bringing this idea up because as we go through and look at the findings in social psychology, I want you to be aware that a lot of these findings are relevant to individualistic cultures. And if you think about what might be true for people in a collectivist culture, may not always be true, because a lot of these studies have not been conducted in collectivist culture. I'm switching gears hard here and going into the scientific method. These steps I'd like you to be familiar with and the order in which they're conducted. First, you have to study, observe people and read about it, state the problem you're interested in. Then you have to develop a hypothesis, like a prediction. I mean, most people think of hypothesis as an educated guess about what you expect to happen. I like to think of it better as a prediction. When this happens, then this will happen. Because then you could test it and then see if your prediction held water or not. In order to state your prediction, though, you also have to state the concepts you're interested in measuring in terms of how you measure it. So if I say I'm studying aggressive behavior, I would have to make clear what behaviors I consider to be aggressive. Otherwise, people might have no idea what I meant by that in my research. So if I meant that, oh, aggressive behavior is a dirty look, that's a little harder to measure. But if I say it is basically a punch, a slap, a kick, a push, and those are the kinds of behaviors I'm measuring, other people can replicate that kind of study and see if they come up with similar results. You pick your type of study. We're going to talk about these different types of studies in just a minute. You run your proposal for studying human behavior by what's called an institutional review board, which exists at any institution that does research on human behavior, hospitals, schools, any place that does research. That usually consists of community members and people in the institution, students, faculty, who review proposals to study people and make sure that study is not going to harm anyone, because there's a history of people studying human behavior where they hurt other people, and that's unethical. The Tuskegee experiment actually changed how all human behavior is studied. Once you collect your data, you analyze it, and you have to report your results, because if you're going to take the time to ask people to provide information, you should share what you find from that information. Types of studies: observational studies, that is just sitting back and watching and not intervening. Or a lot of rich information can be collected that way. So I think some of you may be familiar with, if you took my class for introductory psychology, there was a researcher who just observed by sitting in restaurants and malls and stuff like that when people laughed, and found that most people laugh at times when there's no attempt, like formal attempt at making a joke. And what he found is that most laughter was basically a communication to another person: you're included in our group. That it was more of a social glue and an easing of social communication within a small group of people. And you can find that kind of stuff out from observational studies. It's kind of fascinating. There are also correlational studies and experimental studies, which I want to talk about. Correlations, hopefully you remember this from introductory psychology, do not give you cause and effect relationships. They tell you how much things are associated. As one variable you're interested in goes up, what happens to the other variable? Does it go with it, or does it go in the opposite direction? If two variables move in the same direction, they're positively correlated. As one goes up, the other goes up. As it goes down, the other goes down. That's a positive correlation, association. But again, it's not cause. We know that self-esteem and academic performance are positively correlated, but you can't say one definitely causes the other from correlational research. We know as one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. Negative correlations, that's just the flip side. As one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. So that, I'm trying to think, excuse me, of a brief example of that. As well, the number of hours spent like partying and playing video games goes up, probably academic performance is going to go down. And that would be an inverse relationship or negative correlation. Again, we can't say cause and effect because we need an experiment to do that. This is the last slide for this particular brief presentation. We're talking briefly about the experiment. We have the independent variable and dependent variable. Independent variable is what the researcher manipulates, and the dependent variable is what they sit back and witness and observe to see if that independent variable had an impact on the dependent variable. It's important to randomly assign people to groups if you're doing an experimental study so that you don't accidentally put all the people who showed up first, which might be basically a factor related to conscientiousness, into one group, because then suddenly you have a group that's been biased by overloading it with super conscientious people. And that can affect your results. So you have to randomly assign people to groups. We have internal and external validity, which I'll just mention briefly here in terms of types of experiments you can run. The different types of experiments, I put field studies. One study I found fascinating was done in parking lots. They just went to parking lots to find out how long it takes a person, once they get in the car, to leave a parking space. For 1/3 of the time, there was no other car around, and they just measured. The person just got in their car, how long it took them to leave. Then they had another situation where they saw a person walk to their car, and they had another car pull up, waiting. And so as the person got in the car and they timed it, how long it took for that person to back up and leave the parking spot. The third setup was a person walking to their car, they had another car pull up, and once the person got in the car, they honked their horn and were being really impatient. And they measured how long that took. You can probably guess how long each one took. Actually, the fastest time to vacate was when no other car was waiting. The most time to vacate this parking space was when the person was honking and being impatient. And now that's generalizable. That has good external validity because it was done in like mall parking lots and shopping center parking lots and grocery store parking lots. And so it's like, this happens in real life. That's interesting by itself. But it leaves a lot to be, a lot of things that weren't so readily controlled. So the internal validity might suffer a little bit there. You can't control the weather. You can't control how hot it is. You can't control the rain. So, you know, it might have taken people longer to leave a park spot if they were undoing their umbrella and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So field studies lack a little bit of internal validity because you can't control everything. But a lab study can. So I have up here an example. This looks like a torture chair. And it was used as that. I mean, they told participants that they were going to receive shocks in this chair. And so they divided women into two groups. And they had them fill out informed consent paperwork. And then they said, okay, we're going to show you where the study's going to be conducted. Here's this chair. They told half the women, yeah, we're going to give you shocks in this device, and they hurt really bad. There won't be any permanent damage, but it hurts. It's painful. And they said, now, before we do the painful shock study, we want you to fill out the rest of this paperwork. Do you want to wait by yourself and while you fill this out, or do you want to wait with other people? A second group of women filled the informed consent form out, taken by this laboratory setup, and said, oh, here is the shock chair, but don't worry, the shocks are not going to hurt at all. It's less than a mosquito bite. It's just a tiny little pinch. So it's not painful at all. Oh, by the way, before we do this, we need you to fill out the rest of this paperwork. Do you want to wait alone or with other people? And you can see what I have down here in the results. When people were manipulated to feel these women were to feel highly anxious that the shocks were going to be painful. 2/3 of them wanted to wait with other people. If they thought that if the women in the group who were told it was no more than a mosquito bite or a tiny pinch, only 1/3 of them wanted to wait with other people. So they call this study, Does Misery Love Company? And what they found is like, yeah, people who are made miserable typically want to share in that misery with other people, by as much as 1/3 more than people who aren't so miserable. And that has really good internal validity because nothing was changed except the statement that was made by the researcher. And so you can pretty much draw a ready cause and effect relationship. The only thing that changed there was what the researcher said, and it affected the behavior. The dependent variable was whether women wanted to wait alone or with other people. The independent variable was what the researcher said. These shocks will hurt a lot. The shocks will not hurt very much at all. That's the end of this presentation. I hope this helped in terms of understanding the terms in this chapter.